Yagadanya, it's welcome in the Anawan tongue. I'd like to acknowledge the First Peoples of this country and this place where we're standing here tonight. I acknowledge their elders, past, present and future. The idea for this forum first emerged before the election campaign got underway, and it was triggered largely because of the significant renewable energy developments in our region. The purpose of this forum is to support a discussion between as many of us that we can squeeze in to participate in the time that we have, a discussion about energy. So diving in, presentations from 5 local energy leaders.
The real drivers in a market economy are commercial drivers. Let's not forget that. There's the issue to do with multiple and sequential use. And I think in some cases, in some special cases, this is a nonsense, particularly in the case of mining, for example, in the Liverpool Plains. When the risks are irreversible of causing long-lasting damage, then why would we go ahead with short-term profit for a very, very long-term loss and likely loss in the case of damage to our social fabric of our communities, but also the environmental fabric as well. So how can we solve this problem where our market systems aren't really serving us? Well, I think we have a mechanism in place, a planning mechanism called protected areas. And I'm arguing for agricultural protected areas in our agricultural hotspots of this nation. I think those planning mechanisms, which overcome some of the barriers of the market, help in terms of aligning our political interests, our commercial interests, with the physical and biophysical limits that we need to exist with within our world.
I'm here to tell you how significant the impacts on our health are already, directly through extreme weather and indirectly through land use and nutrition, and how critical it is to limit, change and protect health. Prolonged high temperatures lead to higher rates of heart failure, dehydration, kidney disease and death. Extended and more severe heat waves have also extended the bushfire season. They start earlier, they last longer, they have more frequent and more severe bushfires with devastating effects on people's lives, their livelihoods, and particularly mental health for years after. We in New England are very familiar with these type of effects also caused by drought. A pattern of more severe droughts combined with more intense rainfalls is predicted with ongoing climate change. And we all know what devastating social, economic and mental health impacts drought has on rural farming communities. Air pollution is another major contributor to ill health and originates from bushfires, fossil fuel burning for electricity production and increased urban ozone levels on hot days. Coal-related particle pollution contributes to lung cancer, chronic lung disease, asthma, heart disease and stroke. Approximately 3,000 deaths per year are already attributed to air pollution, which is twice the number of road deaths in 2015.
I'm asked to speak about land, water and nature, but I think that you can't talk about that without talking about the impacts on people, because I think it's the shocking human cost of fossil fuel extraction that brings home to us the real impact on local environments and on the wider climate. So for me, it's the personal stories. I got into this through working with farmers at Maules Creek out near Boggabri, who were confronted out of the blue with a proposal for 3 enormous open-cut coal mines on their doorstep. They're incredibly smart people, incredibly determined. They went through those proposals, they got experts involved, and they exposed all the weaknesses and flaws in them and expected that they would be limited or constrained or withdrawn. But unfortunately, the mining approvals process rolled over them like a juggernaut, and they were given no quarter by either the mining industry or the government. They're now living next door to 3 enormous open-cut coal mines and dealing with severe air pollution that puts at risk their health and their children's health. Their groundwater's being depleted and there's a risk of surface water contamination. And their local environment has been permanently damaged. It will never be the same again. Unfortunately, they've got no way out because the mines aren't required to buy them. So they're left to live there and deal with those consequences. No one will buy land next to 3 coal mines, so they can't sell, they can't get away. They're left in a terrible position, stranded, living in a largely unlivable situation. So the lesson really is that it's up to communities to lead, that we need to take the advantage and defend our land and water and make sure that we propose the alternatives and we push those alternatives and demand that our politicians follow, as we're doing here tonight.
Wind and solar in particular are solid, reliable generators. In some places in the world, they're cheaper than existing forms of conventional generation. It's not the case here yet, but they are cheaper and more or faster to implement than developing new coal power stations or other conventional energy. Right now, in the New England region, the electricity demand is relatively flat, but we're still seeing new wind and solar power plants being developed. The examples, the White Rocks Wind Farm, Sapphire Wind Farm, Moree Solar Farm, and closer to home, University of New England's looking at its own plans for a solar plant to power half of its electricity needs. These sort of projects are happening because of policy. Things like the Renewable Energy Target, which provide a mechanism for a smooth transition to that future that people see. Now, so far I've painted a fairly smooth transition from an existing economy to one sort of powered by wind and solar, but we all know that wind and solar are not or are intermittent generators. The sun doesn't shine at night, all those sort of arguments that are out there. What we now know is that while that's a very challenging situation, it's not a showstopper. The last few years have provided very strong evidence that there are ways through that, and it means an increasing role for battery storage, hydropower, and some of the high-speed conventional generators that you can bring online quickly, like diesel and gas. The National Electricity Objective says that, or sets out a guideline that the electricity network should work for the long-term security, reliable, safe and efficient power supply to consumers. And to a large extent, this is what consumers want. They rely on electricity and want a quality system they can afford. But it's the policy settings that will enable that to happen. And in addition to that, you then need to consider the externalities around environment and so on.
Communities across Australia and New England are inspired and committed to being part of a clean energy future. They're putting their effort and skills and coming together to create renewable energy projects in their local area. They're driven by wanting to take significant action on climate change, by wanting new sources of income for their farms and their communities, and by knowing that renewable energy just makes sense. Community-owned renewable energy projects are projects where people come together to initiate, develop, own and benefit from renewable energy. These projects take all shapes and sizes, and even just here in the New England there are many examples. A local project run by Farming the Sun, for example, coordinated a bulk buy of solar panels that installed almost $7 million worth of panels onto people's roofs. Another example, community investors funded a solar array on the roof of the Boggabri pub. There's plans here for a community-owned multi-megawatt wind farm. There's plans for a biodigester in Manila that would turn waste into energy. There's plans for whole towns like Uralla to become carbon neutral. New England has excellent renewable energy resources. We're on the edge of a huge transition, and communities deserve and want to participate in that. In Australia, we've had policy to support household renewable energy, we've had policies to support large-scale renewable energy, but they've been variable. Now we call on our federal representatives to push for and implement stable, lasting and genuine action on renewable energy in ways that will open up the opportunity and benefit for all Australians.
What is your most serious energy related concern for this election? So that's the first question. So some very strong emphasis coming through. Health, climate change, coal seam gas. What's the most valuable energy-related opportunity? Leadership, 100% renewables, sustainability, buyback. Guessing that's grid, power systems. We're very grateful for the 6 candidates of the 10 who are running for this electorate who are with us tonight.
The key word to me in relation to tonight's function and the policy areas that we're discussing is leadership. Leadership globally in terms of the climate issue, leadership nationally in terms of policy, whether that be renewable energy targets or the pricing arrangements in terms of emissions, all of those issues that seem to be sadly lacking just in recent years, I think. I see enormous opportunities in terms of renewable energy, quite incredible opportunities. And we talk about jobs and growth, and some people have got that as an election motto, but we really do have some opportunities in this part of the world to show real leadership. This isn't just about the environment, it is also about the economy. And I think people have got to start and recognise, get away from this handbrake effect that if anybody talks about climate variability, climate change, that it is some sort of green issue that must be led from some sort of left-wing organisation that's shady and green. Sorry, Mercurius. That is not the way to think about these issues. We've got an incredible opportunity to embrace some of these issues. We've got to get the policy right. We've got to get the feed-in tariff arrangements, and I'm sure Rob will talk about those sorts of things. There is a number of policy initiatives that we need to address. Just very quickly, if I could, before the gong goes, we have to also ensure, and some of our speakers have already spoken about this, that our key agricultural areas, particularly where our massive water resources are involved, are protected, looked after, and are assessed objectively in terms of the science revolving around those particular resources. Thank you.
So the solar industry is a very young industry, but it's grown in that time to be an industry that can make a massive difference. Now, we've touched on battery storage tonight, and look, that's probably the next step that we're going to move to, I think, in the solar industry, and there's some amazing developments happening there in that industry. There's a battery called a flow battery, which is partly developed by the CSIRO. Now that battery is something that I think can be rolled out all over Australia to back up our grid. And that really is something we need to keep an eye on. My belief is, unless we get a feed-in tariff that is reasonable, I'm not sure if we can move forward with the solar industry. My feeling is that even if we got 12 cents per kilowatt hour, we could actually move forward quite quickly. We have to really invest into research and development into the renewable energy industry. And we have a fabulous university right here that we should be utilising, and we're not.
What other first world country would allow a foreign national to develop an open-cut coal mine on its prime agricultural land? I've been very lucky, and I've come to this election with a skill set of both a detailed corporate property background, being a former fellow of the Australian Property Institute, and having working as a lawyer. And those two factors enabled me to take on the Petroleum Onshore Act. Now, with the increase of proposed coal seam gas mining, they are controlled in New South Wales by the Petroleum Onshore Act. That act was made by parliamentarians. When the politicians say they can do nothing, there is a lot they can do. They can amend or vary or repeal legislation to give landowners, landholders and farmers a fairer, more equitable say in what goes on with their land. So I'm standing purely because I'm so outraged by what was proposed and is still proposed on the Breezer Plains. If the Breezer Plains falls, New England falls. Thank you.
On the technical side, I think we can all look to and be led by, in New South Wales, our departed Greens colleague, the late Dr. John Kay, who really was such an expert and a true genius in applied mathematics, and whose thesis on electrical power distribution in large grids and the efficiencies is still in use today from the 80s. But he also, through his work, came to the realisation that 100% renewable power for New South Wales was possible and affordable and required. There is nothing radical about protecting land and water, and there's nothing radical about voting for a safe and stable climate that supports our civilisation and our agriculture. But I would add to that also that conservative New England has a progressive history. Tamworth in 1888 switched on the first electric lights in Australia. We've been contributing to global warming since 1888, yay us. But also that, that was a lady mayor, Elizabeth Piper, who did that. So we have a progressive history in the region, and I'm sure we can be that again. Just in our last minute, other initiatives politically, we need to end fossil fuel donations, and that's the Greens platform. And we also need to talk about the sustainability of our mining in general, beyond fossil fuel mining. Lithium extraction, which is what we need for the battery revolution, is tremendously damaging the way we're extracting it. We need to be honest about this and look at how can we get to a renewable carbon neutral economy without laying waste to South America and central China in the process. So I'll finish on this note. For all of us here tonight who want to be taken seriously on global warming, we all need to commit to no new fossil fuel projects in Australia, not just the Liverpool Plains, not just New England, the whole of Australia. I put that challenge to every candidate here tonight, including anyone who's been involved in bringing coal mines into the Gunnedah Basin in the past. Thank you.
I must say that I disagree a little bit with Carmel. Which might be the first disagreement of the night. I think that political parties, especially our political party, and certainly the Greens have been at the forefront of this argument. They are listening to the community. The problem is there are people in the community that don't believe what you believe, but you've got to bring people with you in these things. And sometimes the change isn't as fast as what some people would like. But the ALP has this policy of 50% renewables by 2030. And there was a point made about community power. We've got 100 million over 4 years for community power network and hubs. I'm very much hoping that there's a focus on regions for that funding. 206 million to the Renewable Energy Agency. And among the benefits of these sorts of policies, that's only scratching the surface. The ALP takes this very seriously. We're a party of science. All right, this has got nothing to do with ideology. I was reading an environmental impact study from a CSG company in Gloucester. I think it might have been AGL. The science just isn't there for certain of these other kind of extractive processes. Now, while that doesn't necessarily mean that I support closing down all coal mines tomorrow, there certainly has to be a transition to green energy, and that's going to be absolutely key in this seat. So again, I agree with many of the points, but there is leadership in this space. When we tried to have an emissions trading scheme, the other mob got rid of it. So that took out billions of dollars of green energy investment. We've had thousands of millions of jobs created worldwide. Australia lost around 2,600 green energy jobs. Now, I'll use a word I used earlier today, holistic. We need to take everybody with us. We need to take our farmers with us. We need to take industry, business. We need to educate our kids, and we need to have that policy focus. Again, instead of being so narrow on fossil fuels, if we can shift it towards green energy, there's no reason why we can't reap those economic benefits.
Our society is built on our agricultural productivity and our land and water. When we started to talk about country minded about 18 months ago, and when we were dismissed as being irrelevant and not understanding politics, that was the core foundation, how we respect our land and water, how we respect the foundation and cornerstone of what we all have in this environment. And I'd appreciated Carmel's comments about how we actually roll over our land and water resources and assets and how we actually destroy them. So protecting those land and water assets is critical to my mind in terms of how we transition. And it's the fundamental philosophy that we've got to understand if we want to transition.
My question is, where do the candidates stand on reintroducing a carbon price, including an emissions trading scheme?
We had one. They got rid of it. Would like it back.
Is that it was the saddest day when we scrapped the carbon tax. It was something that we should still have, and I believe there'd be many projects rolled out today if it was still there.
I think we will see an emissions trading scheme at some time in the future, and probably what was envisaged some time ago, a globally linked emissions trading scheme. I think with the opportunities, the expertise, the battery technologies, the solar thermal technologies, all of these technologies that are out there, and a lot of them getting cheaper, that we'll see a magic moment where the world will say we're moving and we're going to move quickly.
I'd like the candidates to comment on whether they think the major media has made a useful contribution to the energy debate and what they should be doing.
It's that the community actually is leading the transition to renewable energy. The community is actually leading the debate, and we're not getting a response out of our media to that transition. And one of the things that I think is happening is that the government's taking its lead from the media, and they're not actually following the lead of the community.
I think we can understand why we don't want government and politicians stepping in with what the media are saying and doing, but you can see who is advertising in the major commercial presses. You can see how many fossil fuel ads there are in those publications and TV news. You can decide what papers you'll buy and what news you'll consume. But also we need to expand that earlier question about fossil fuel donations to media companies too, and how they're contributing to politics through their money.
If you were in power in the first 100 days, what would be the most important change that you would make in terms of renewable energy?
One of the things that could be done very quickly relates to the Liverpool Plains and the need to restart the bioregional assessment process that was put in place under the water trigger that I had something to do with.
And I would be trying to help industry to become more efficient, particularly with energy, and try and make a difference in that way. And I think that's one way we could really move this country forward fairly quickly.
I would just look at something along the lines of taxation relief to enable the average punter to be able to afford solar to put on their home.
We in the Greens would cancel the petroleum exploration licences and refund, give back the money to Shenhua and Adani and the dollars that were taken. Those projects have been hanging over people's heads for years.
The market mechanisms already exist as far as helping people get solar panels and that. I mean, tax relief is one way of doing it. You can get a 6% loan, which is reasonably low.
How do we improve the regulation?
And that's one thing that's really hampered our solar industry for a long, long time is regulation.
Well, one of the most pertinent dimensions of regulation, of course, means retaining public ownership of the assets. So that's something the Greens have long campaigned on and will continue to do so. We can't be privatising these assets and then say 1 year and then saying we want better regulation the next.
Yep. There's a lot of people calling for a review of the national electricity market objective that would broaden it. At present, it's got a very, very narrow remit to provide a steady electricity supply. We need to introduce a national electricity market objective that would include equity, social equity, and would include environmental objectives. If we're able to introduce those things into the National Electricity Market Objective, it would increase the scope for policymakers to take equity and environmental considerations into account.
In principle, I agree that it needs to support environmental objectives, but currently that is, effectively dealt with through a separate stream, which is your, say, the renewable energy target and carbon tax and other policies. outside of the National Electricity Objective. Electricity Objective is focused on delivery of the electricity to customers.
What we've got to do is design a policy mix that allows a transition to take place from a centralised system to a decentralised system and regional systems where we have all of the things that Rob and others have been talking about, encouraging communities to take charge.
Will you commit to 100% renewable power by 2030?
I think it's a no-brainer, and yes, the difficulty then falls. How do we do that equitably and socially responsibly? So, yes, in principle, it's a great idea.
But there is actually a need to have base load power in some instances. So I'm not sure whether you might get close, but I'm not sure you'd ever get 100%.
Yes, it's an opportunity to catch up with China, South Korea, Japan, Spain and Germany.
Can be done. It would take an amazing effort, but we'd all have to get up in the morning and start doing something about it.
I'd agree with David Mailer. I think the 100% target could possibly be achieved, but the real hard yards, and we just talked about this a moment ago, is going to be the policy mix that drives that.
Yep.
In the end of the day, the economics will drive it rather than the environmental objective. And whether that can be really done by 2030, I don't know, but I don't think it hurts to have a target to aim for.
What policy can be devised or changed to achieve fair solar feed-in tariffs for household solar energy producers who are currently hostages to the big energy companies, and can this encompass and act as an incentive to further solar investment at grassroots levels?
We're not going to move forward until we can have a decent feed-in tariff, but it's got to be done federally. It cannot be done state by state, and it's got to be uniform.
Large generators, the coal power stations, whatever else, are paid between 2 and 5 cents for the electricity that they generate and put into the grid. So if you as a householder are being paid more than that, that is an effective wealth transfer from other customers, or some other way it's distributed within the mechanism. It's not just because you're paying 30 cents for the electricity you're buying from the grid doesn't mean that's the value of the energy that you can export.
The consequences of not acting on climate change are quite dire. So that leads me to the question, do we think we're doing this fast enough? The question is not when, the question is how fast.
We're certainly not going quick enough. We're already at 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. We're already halfway to this global warming safety rail. We're at 0.8 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. We can only go to 1.5 even remotely safely. So we're already off the cliff.
But the knock-on consequences into our agricultural production systems with a 2 degrees to 4 degrees rise in temperature are going to be catastrophic.
Carbon sequestration, I think, is a big thing, and I've talked a bit about incentivisation. I'd like to see farmers more incentivised to revegetate. It takes a lot of carbon out of the air.
What are we actually risking? And a lot of the other things we've talked about might be all very pleasant, but if the risk to the very globe that we live on long term is high, we're really risking future generations. If we believe that by doing very little or nothing, that if Bangladesh, for instance, goes underwater, or the African continent suffers severe famines, if we actually believe that those people will just stay there and die, we are kidding ourselves. There will be mass movements of people across the globe. And Australians tend to think that because we're an island and we're building some new submarines and we've got a few boats running around the edge of it, that we're insulated, that we don't really have to do anything about this because it's not really our argument. It should be China or India or someone else.
So how can we make sure that renewable energy, the money generated from renewable energy, goes towards the Australian people, back to the Australian people, rather than into the private sector?
The public sector is big enough to achieve the changes we need because little tiny communities where there's not a lot of profit to be made will never be of interest to private corporations the way they can be to a public sector.
The one thing that we've been working on to solve some of these problems is a microgrid, and to explain a microgrid, it could be one complete block in say, Uralla, for instance, where we could hook everybody up to a microgrid. Now, that would mean people who couldn't afford to have solar could be connected in a way where they could purchase power at a far cheaper rate through peer-to-peer trading. And this is a really, really exciting concept, and it's something we've been looking at for a while, and I believe it could work, particularly as a committee. I've been speaking with the Manila people, and they're really excited about doing something along those lines.
Germany has an enormous amount of renewable energy, and 45% of that is owned by citizens. That's been something that's occurred in a very stable and supportive policy environment, but it is very much possible for people, for individuals to invest and keep that money circulating in local economies when the opportunity is open for them to invest in renewable energy.
The question we're asking of you now is to vote which candidate best represents your preferred energy future. Need a little bit more time. And of course, we're talking one policy within a maelstrom of policy. I'd like you to join me in thanking very gratefully our candidates for tonight, and in thanking our local community energy leaders, and how fortunate we are to have such a breadth and depth of talent in our midst. I'd like to thank the fellow members of the organising committee, the sponsors, and all of our partners.